Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a big 8-game slate for college basketball. At the end of the video, I will go through each game and each team and give you my insight on those particular games. So wait for that at the end of the video. But for this slate, we have a pretty good slate. I do think there's a decent amount of, there's basically 3 value guys I like quite a bit. So you're going to be able to pay up some for some expensive players. And there's a couple guys in the middle here that are pretty decent as well. But it isn't the best slate when it comes to fantasy. I feel like a lot of teams felt pretty overpriced. But there are some guys, some teams that look really good. The lowest scoring game on the slate is the Washington-California game. That also has the biggest spread with 8 points for Washington. And then the highest scoring game on the slate is Memphis and Wichita State, which has a 2-point spread. This is the best spread on the slate. There's no games that look like they're going to be giant blowouts, but there's no games that are really, the most extreme is that 8-point spread rather for Washington, and then a 7-point spread for UCLA. And those 2 games are the lowest scoring games on the slate. So overall, I think this is going to be a solid slate where all the games are going to be relatively tight. And the scoring differential is not all that much different, with the exception of the top two games against the rest of the field, and both those games are very tight. So, with that said, let's get into the players. Before I do that, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really helps the channel a lot. I really do appreciate it. So, with that said, let's get into it here. We're gonna start with Drew Peterson for USC here. He's got some really big time upside here. He's got almost as much upside as anybody on the slate, with the exception of Pickett for Penn State. And he has played really well against Colorado this season. He had 30 fantasy points last time, and he's definitely very interesting here. He and Boogie Ellis both get the ball a lot and score a lot of points, and this is going to be a type of game where I expect both of them to play well and to get a lot of opportunity with the ball. USC is one of the teams that is on a faster paced game, and they are in a very tight game. So I think that both those guys are going to be useful. I'm going to talk about Boogie Ellis here. He's a little bit not quite as consistent as Drew Peterson, but they're basically the same price. I think Peterson gets a little bit more rebounds and assists than Ellis does, but Ellis has almost just as much upside. And you could even consider utilizing both guys on your lineup. But if I'm going to pick one, I'm going to go with Drew Peterson, and then Boogie Ellis would be the secondary option between the two. But you're going to have to figure out how you want to utilize those guys on the slate. It is definitely possible to use both guys on the slate if you want. Then we're going to look at Craig Porter Jr. He's a good alternative to one of those guys, or even both. For Wichita State, he's in the highest scoring game on the slate, and he's in a really good spot here. He's played really well this season, and he has really good opportunity here to score over 30 fantasy points, which he did the last 2 times he's played Memphis, and I expect him to continue that. As you can see, the last game he had 31 fantasy points against Memphis, and he had decent rebounds and assists in that game as well as a couple blocks and stuff. So he looks like he's in a pretty solid spot. I think that he's probably just as good as Ellis when it comes to being a pick. However, he doesn't quite have the upside that Peterson and Ellis have, but they're all virtually in the same price range, and he might be slightly safer than Boogie Ellis. So, just depending on how you want to roll with that, I think he's a very good play on the slate where Wichita is one of the highest scoring teams on it. Then we're going to look at Elijah McCadden for Memphis. Now, he doesn't have the fantasy points per minute that I typically like. Even at guard, he's only at 0.7, but he does have a pretty good floor here, and he's played really well as of late. He started the last 12 games and only had 1 bad game in that stretch due to fouls. I expect him to be pretty good today as a good kind of a mid-level value option that can kind of pay off just to utilize him to save yourself some money so you can afford some other guys. He looks like he's in a pretty solid spot. Again, he's not going to, 10x on you or something like that most of the time, but he does have a decent floor for this slate, and since he's been starting, he's been playing pretty solid. So I think he's in a really good spot, and he's in a nice plus matchup too, where the scoring should be high, and he should get good minutes as long as he can stay out of foul trouble, which he's not had too much trouble with this season, but he had 1 game in this since he started starting where that was an issue. Then we're going to look at our forwards here, and we're going to start with DeAndre Williams for Memphis. He has $9,100 today. He has been hitting his ceiling against Wichita State this season, which is over 50 fantasy points, and he's averaging 1.19 fantasy points per minute. He has some really big time upside for this potential matchup. He had 29 and 15 against them last time. I expect him to have a similar type of game. This game should be high scoring. He should have all the opportunities to score a lot of fantasy points in this one. And even though his floor is kind of low the last couple of games, he hasn't been playing all that well. He'll likely get a double-double in this game. It just looks like it's primed for him to do that. And while he doesn't do that a ton, in certain situations with certain matchups, he does. And this is the type of matchup I like to see him in. Then we're going to look at Kenny Poto for Wichita State. I really do like Wichita State today. He's got double-double potential here as well, just like Williams does, and he's a lot cheaper. He's actually a lot cheaper than I expected him to be on the slate. I'm sorry, that is incorrect. He is not double-double potential. Well, he does actually have a little bit double-double potential, but I wrote that in my thing, and I was looking at his stats. I was like, why did I say that? But yeah, he does actually have some double-double potential because he does get rebounds occasionally, and this kind of matchup where there's going to be a lot of shots and a lot of scoring opportunity, and so he will have double-double potential. He's just not somebody that gets it a lot, but he does have big scoring games. His floor has kept his price down, which is nice, and he has decent upside as a result of that because he does have a high ceiling. So especially at the price he's currently at, he had 25 points, fantasy points the last time against Memphis, and I expect him to have probably a better game than that, honestly. I think he's going to be closer to 28, 29. And he's played really well as of late, which definitely gives him a boost as well. Uh, Last time out, he didn't even reach double figures in any statistic, which is actually more impressive because it was kind of one of those games where he ended up fouling out and played less minutes, but he still managed to score 24 or 25 fantasy points. So I think he's in a really good spot. Then Hunter Dickinson for Michigan. Now his price is a little hefty here, but he is double-double potential as well, and he's played really solid most of the season. He hasn't been hitting his ceiling as much late, so he does carry a little bit of risk here, and he's on a team that's not projected to win and has kind of a slowdown game going here. But he is priced good enough that he's got some potential. He's priced down from where he has been, mostly due to these lackluster games where he hasn't really done all that much, comparatively to what he was doing early in the year. But as long as he's under $9,000, he's somebody you have to take in consideration just because of his potential upside. And then we're going to look at Harrison Ingram for Stanford. He's kind of the weakest guy on this on my list here. He has some pretty good upside, and his price is okay. But like Poto for Wichita, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering his name. I don't know how to say it. If he has more upside than Ingram does, and he's cheaper. But Ingram is another guy that you could take a look at. He had 14, 9, and 6 against Washington State last time he played them, and so he has a really good floor. He's not somebody that's gonna 10x or anything like that, but he has some nice upside, and he's got a solid floor, which gives him some nice potential here. I do think he's in a good spot, and I think he'll be a good play on the slate. Then we're going to look at a couple other players that are more expensive in the guard position, and that is going to be Pickett and Jaquez Jr. I wanted to mention these two guys before I get into my value plays because of their situation. Jalen Pickett, he actually looks pretty solid today. He has got as much upside as anybody on the slate, but his price is extremely high, and it's going to be a little bit harder to utilize him due to his due to his price and not having a ton of value plays available that feel real good, and so it is kind of risky. But he's been over 31 fantasy points against Ohio State in the 3 games he's played against them, and that is basically his floor. And so while he hasn't really had a giant game against Ohio State in his career, he's had some really big games this season, and if they're going to win this game, he's going to have a big one. He's had 59 fantasy points or more in the last 2 games he's played, which is why his price has popped up so much. But he's still somebody you have to consider on the slate if you can fit him in. And then for Jamie Jaquez Jr. for UCLA, he's in a similar situation where he feels a little overpriced just due to his recent outburst of big-time games, but he does have a big-time upside, and he has a decent floor here. The risk here is he's in one of the slowest slowdown games on the slate, and I'm not sure it's enough value here to make him viable just because of the risk involved with the slowdown game. I don't expect them to score over 70 points in this game. The Oregon State game where he scored 27 fantasy points and the USC game where he scored 29 fantasy points is probably more in line with what I would expect him to do today. And so that's, he's still viable because he has the potential to have a big game, but I don't necessarily see it as the best option today. Then we're going to look at our value plays here. And we're going to start with Matthew Nicholson. He's my favorite value play on the slate at $4,100. He does start. He has been starting lately, at least, and he plays 18 to 25 minutes a game on average. And he's got 25 fantasy point upside, and he has had no games all season long under 10 fantasy points. And even at this price, if he gets 10 fantasy points, then we're more than happy with that. Obviously, we'd like him to get a little bit more, which he has the upside to do. But even if he doesn't, he seems like a really safe option on the slate. As you can see, there are no games under 10 fantasy points on the season. So that's pretty impressive, especially for a guy that doesn't play a ton of minutes all the time. He plays 18 to 25 minutes. So I think he's a great option on the slate, and it doesn't require much for him to pay off for us. Then we're going to look at Rasmus Melendez, RJ Melendez for Illinois. He is very dependent on if Terrence Shannon remains out due to his concussion. We'll have to wait and see because apparently Shannon is a game time decision today. So if he's out, Melendez is interesting. Now he's not a great play because he's been very inconsistent this season, even in the starting position role sometimes. And sometimes he just doesn't get the minutes and he doesn't shoot the ball well, and he doesn't always get rebounds and assists and stuff. As you can see, he almost never gets assists. So he actually rebounds the ball pretty well for a guard, though. So he is interesting from that perspective. But you do want to make sure he ends up starting and that Shannon is out. But he would be my second favorite value play on the slate. My third favorite is Ben Carlson. For Utah at $4,500. He's a little bit more expensive than the other two guys I mentioned. He's not super ideal here, but he has had some good games as of late. He does have the very low floor, and he is inconsistent, but there just isn't much else available, and he does start most of the time, so I think he's got a decent ceiling in this game, and he's played well as of late. But again, he's not somebody that's going to blow you out of the water and pay off big time, and he does have a really low floor, and he's inconsistent with his minutes. So do keep all that in mind, but he does have some interesting upside in this matchup against Utah. Or against UCLA, rather. Sorry. And then we're going to look at two other guys that I wanted to mention, Melvin Flanagan for Wichita State, and also Jaden Hardaway from Memphis. Now, both these guys look somewhat interesting today at their basically minimum prices, under $3,600. Melvin Flanagan started the last game and scored 17 fantasy points, and he started a couple games this season, but it's very hit and miss with him, and he doesn't seem to play all the time either. So I'm not sure why he really just got jumped into the starting lineup all of a sudden. So we'll have to wait and see if he gets in that starting lineup again. But if he does, he would definitely be somebody to take a look at this near minimum price. As for Hardaway, he's in a little bit better position as it comes to like getting some minutes game to game. But he's still been very inconsistent. But at his price point, if you just need a $3,600 player, one of these guys could potentially pay off as a good option at a cheap price to get your 10 to 15 fantasy points to kind of round out a roster. So I did want to mention them. I don't necessarily love them, but they are still available and probably the best guys under 4,000 that you could find. With that said, thank you guys for liking, commenting, subscribing. I'm going to get into my main slate here. I'm going to get into the slate, my team breakdown real quick. Okay, so we're going to start with, let's see here. I'm going to start with the Ohio State and Penn State game here. And so we have two teams here that are going to play this game pretty close. It's the second highest scoring game on the slate at 142 points. And Ohio State is projected to win the game by 2 points. Ohio State has looked really good throughout the season. And this matchup and upside is pretty decent here. If they would play Bryce Singbaugh more, I would definitely think he is a good play. But from his minutes per game, he kind of gets capped. and so his price is a little bit too high for my likelihood here, and so I don't really like him, and I don't really like anybody on this team for that matter, simply because everybody seems overpriced. They go a little bit too deep in the bench, and they just don't have anybody that jumps off the page as a must play on the slate. A lot of the guys just seem overpriced in general. For Penn State, Pickett looks like an interesting play here. You can make a small argument for Lundy as well, but this game should be close and should be high scoring. And those two guys definitely have a good 1-2 punch for Penn State. They just don't really have much else that makes good plays, game to game. And they have some guys that have some positive games here and there, but Pickett and Lundy are really the only two guys that have any viability on this game at all. Then we're going to look at Memphis and Wichita State. Now, this is the highest scoring game on the slate, and Memphis is projected to win. Memphis is in the position to win. They have really good options here with DeAndre Williams looking like a must play today. Kendrick Davis also has some upside if he wants to play, but he may be a game time decision today, so you keep that in mind. And he didn't play in the last game. No one else really plays consistent minutes and has good fantasy upside other than McAdden. And so there's not a ton of guys to look for there in Memphis, but there's a couple, and you're definitely going to want to pull from players from this game. As for Wichita State, they have a few good plays in Poto and Porter, and then, of course, they have a couple other secondary options like Walton who look interesting, and then they have a risky cheap play in Flanagan. This game should definitely be a game that shows up in your roster in some capacity. So I do recommend utilizing some players from those two teams. But there's some of the more like mid-level price guys in the $4,000 to $6,000 range aren't particularly great, with the exception of one or two of them. So that's basically McAdden and Poto. So this the 4,000 to 6,000 range is pretty weak for this particular game. But overall, they have some good high price players that you're going to probably want to utilize today. Alright, so now I'm going to break down the games and get through each team and tell you what I think about each individual team and the game itself. We're going to start with the Penn State and Ohio State game here. This particular game looks like it's going to be pretty tight, and it is one of the higher scoring games on the slate. For Ohio State, it is a good matchup and has good upside here, but there's really only one player that really looks interesting at all, and that's Bryce Sensabaugh, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, but he doesn't really play enough minutes to make him a must-play by any stretch, and his price is not super ideal based on that. In fact, nobody on this team really plays over 28 minutes to game, and they do shuffle their roster around and stuff like that, and Sensabaugh doesn't always start, so it is kind of a streaky-ish game. I don't really like any player from Ohio State because everybody else seems a little bit overpriced and they don't play enough minutes. So it's a little bit hard to roster anybody from this team. Same kind of goes for Penn State. They have basically a 1-2 punch in Pickett and Lundy. And while Pickett is somewhat interesting, Lundy is kind of a minor option, and he can play both guard and forward. They don't really have anybody else that's definitely all that useful, and it's a little bit more risky just because those guys are priced a little bit higher than I would typically like them to be for when they're being utilized in fantasy, and so I just don't like much anything in this game for that matter. There's plenty of other teams that have high-scoring games where you have good options that are a little bit better priced, and so I think it's probably best to stay away from that game, but you could do a secondary type of roster where you use Pickett or Lundy, and maybe even Sensabaugh as options, but there's really just not much in the value aspect from this game at all. Then we're going to go ahead and look at Memphis and Wichita State, and Memphis is projected to win this game by 2 points, and this is the highest scoring game on the slate, 146 points. They are favored to win, and they have some good options today. DeAndre Williams looks like a must-play. He's my favorite player on the slate, I think. He has big-time upside in this game. Kendrick Davis is questionable and a game-time decision likely, and if he does play, then he would be somewhat interesting, but his price is a little bit higher than I'd like it to be, but he does have some upside in this game if he does end up playing. He didn't play the last game, so do keep that in mind. Elijah McCaden also looks like a really interesting option for Memphis today, and he's at pretty good price as well, so he's somebody that I would definitely consider as a mid-level price range guy. And could pay off for you. This Memphis-Wichita State game, not only does it have some of the better plays available, but they also seem the most reasonably priced of all the games, despite being the highest scoring game on the slate. And that's pretty interesting, especially when you look at Wichita State, where you look at Porter and Pota. Sorry for butchering your names. They both look really awesome in this slate, and they have really good potential. Even Walton, Jaquan Walton for Wichita State has some nice upside as well. He's kind of a secondary option on this slate. And then we even have some cheap slate plays in this game with Flanagan and Hardaway for Memphis and Wichita State, respectively. I think both these guys have some interesting potential in this game, but very risky. But overall, that game has a lot to offer, and I think that winning lineups are going to have some guys from those two teams, and so you're definitely going to want to take a look at those teams to determine, to figure this slate out. Then we're going to look at the Rutgers and Michigan game. Now, this game is one of the lower scoring games on the slate, and Rutgers is favored to win the game by 6. If anyone is worth a look on this team, it's Maury. Sorry if I'm butchering your name. He's played really solid throughout the season, but he's a little bit overpriced here, and I do think there's better options that have just as much upside as him for a cheaper price. And everybody else on this team seems a little bit overpriced as well, so it's really hard to feel like anybody's feels comfortable on Rutgers, but they are favored to win the game. And if you wanted to use Clifford, then I wouldn't be super upset about it. Then when I look at Michigan, I think Hunter Dickinson is the only guy that looks decent at all. Buffkin has some upside, but his price is not super ideal for the matchup, and the injuries on this team also, kind of have some question for how this game might go. A lot of guys are questionable, and we'll have to wait and see how those things play out. But all of the guys seem a little bit overpriced. But if there's a value guy that ends up getting in the starting lineup, that could potentially make a difference on this particular slate. Then we're going to look at Illinois and Northwestern. Now, Illinois is favored to win this game by 6 points, and it is a decently it does have a decent points total at 137, and so it is interesting here. If Shannon remains out, that would give Melendez a great value opportunity. So that is probably the best, one of the better value options, assuming that Shannon is out. Shannon is probably a game time decision due to his concussion, so we will have to wait and see about that. But they do look somewhat interesting today. I don't know that too many other players look very good for this team, simply because they seem a little bit overpriced for the matchup, but they have some interest there in general. Then we're going to look at Northwestern, and they aren't favored to win, but they have some of the best value plays in Nicholson on the slate, and an argument could be made for Boo Buie, who is $8,800. He is pricey, though, and he is outside of that. He does have a good high... my microphone died. But so Boo Buie has some nice upside here, but he is a little bit pricey, so he is somebody to consider, but he isn't a must play, especially being on a losing team that's favored to lose by 6 to 8 points. With that said, let's go ahead and get into the USC the USC Colorado game here. Now this game is somewhat interesting because it's a very tight game, and they are expected to score over 140 points in this one. I don't feel like Colorado is super priced ideally here, but they have somebody like Luke O'Brien who would be somewhat interesting today at $5,700. He's had some big-time games lately, but he's been inconsistent throughout the season. But as long as he's starting, he definitely looks viable. But I felt like everybody else on the team looked overpriced. Then we're going to look at USC, and obviously in a higher-scoring game, Drew Peterson and Boogie Ellis look very interesting here, and they will be a big part of the offense, so I expect them to play well in this game. Reese Dixon-Waters also has a slight interest, does look slightly interesting today, assuming he does, get to play after being out with the injury a couple games. So if he does play again, which I expect him to do, I do think he has some viability, but he's still a risky play on the slate, but he has some opportunity here. Then we're going to look at the, let's see here, USC, Washington, California game here. Oops, let me click off these. Sorry about that. For Washington, they're favored to win the game by 8 points, and this is the lowest scoring game on the slate. And there's not really a single player on this team that is consistent at all. Even though everybody is priced pretty low on this team, there just wasn't a lot to like. I mean, Keon Brooks is the most expensive player, and he's been pretty inconsistent lately. If I was going to use anybody, I guess it would be Minifield, but he's been really streaky and hasn't played very well as of late. He has been restricted in needing, he has been somewhat restricted in his scoring ability. And so, with it being a low scoring game, and they're not exactly slated to score a lot of points, I think that maybe midfield's the only guy if you need a utility player that's $6,500. But that's probably much the only way I'd use anybody from the team. As for California, they're projected to lose this game, and this is the lowest. This is the biggest spread on the slate at 8 points. And one of their better players has missed a couple games as of late, which doesn't help them either. And nobody is priced well here. They're all priced low, but there's nothing exciting. Nobody's very good, and I just don't like this game at all. I think it's a game to avoid in general on this particular slate. Then we're going to look at Stanford and Washington State. I'm sorry. Stanford and Washington State here. Stanford is projected to win this game by 2 points. Harrison Ingram is an interesting play today, but everybody else is a bit less ideal. No one really plays more than 30 minutes a game on this team, so it's hard to like anyone all that much. But they are favored to win a tight game, and so that will give them their best player, which is Ingram, some opportunity, I think. And so I think they do have some viability from that perspective. As for Washington State, they have one high ceiling player, which is TJ Bamba, but I don't think he's a great play today, simply because his floor is pretty low and his fantasy points per minute is really low, and he really doesn't have a lot of upside in this matchup either. As for the final game on the slate, which is UCLA and Utah, this game looks really interesting. UCLA has some interesting options here, being that even though that they are one of the lowest scoring games on the slate, and it's a -7 in UCLA's favor, Jamie Jaquez Jr. is a decent option, but I feel like there's more guys that are just as much upside as him that are $1,000 less, and everybody else is relatively overpriced, making them somewhat hard to roster. But you could make an argument for Clark and Campbell, but it's not an ideal matchup when it comes to that. As for Utah, I really do like Ben Carlson today. He seems a little bit under the radar, in my opinion, and he has some interesting upside, though he does have a low floor. But it's also a low-scoring game, and they're not really projected to score very many points, only 62. And so it is a little bit risky, but he's played well enough lately, and he gets some rebounds and stuff that gives him some opportunity. So I'm not sure that there's too much else on Utah that you would want to use, or from this game even. But if you're going to use anybody, Carlson's probably the best bet on the team. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. And have a nice day, guys.